In this video, we're going to show you the basic disassembly, reassembly, parts identification, and maintenance of the X7 Phenom valve. If you're not sure how to get to this point, you can actually refer to one of our earlier videos on how to remove the flex valve from the Phenom. First, going to start off by removing some of these parts. Here's your bolt spring, your bolt. You have your damper O-ring. You also have a small spacer that sits behind the damper O-ring, your power tube, and your valve. You also have your trigger pin, which we're going to go ahead and remove. Just go ahead and remove that with a pair of needle noses. Now, if your trigger pin's not exposed, you can actually air up the marker before disassembling and take the air source off without pulling the trigger, and it will expose that pin. So then from there, we'll just go ahead and remove our plug for our trigger pin. And you have a set of O-rings in here. We'll kind of get those out real quick. And you have a small brass spacer in here too, which we'll also try to remove. Okay, so we got that spacer out. You have your spacer and your O-ring. There's also another O-ring that's recessed in here. It's kind of a little harder to get to, and I usually just leave it in there anyways. You can put a small dab of the grease provided. Just put a little dab in there and put your spacer back in. Just kind of wiggle it around, drop it back in. Put your O-ring in there. You can also put just a small little dab of grease on that and put your trigger pin plug back in. Just make sure this is snug at all times. If it were to ever come loose, it'll actually cause the gun to malfunction in the electronic mode. So just make sure that that's nice and snug. Then from there, you can just dab a little bit of grease onto the trigger pin. And just go ahead and reinsert that. And that's pretty much just the basic maintenance for the trigger pin portion of the valve. We'll go ahead, we'll remove our gauge plug. Then from there, if you have a 3/16, you can take your regulator cap off the back, or a lot of people call it a velocity adjuster. It essentially does the same thing. Then you have your regulator spring, and you have your regulator piston. Then from there, we're going to remove our regulator housing. Now, most of these are really tight because they're actually, the valve assembly is put into a vise, and then they really tighten down this, regulator housing. But in this video, I kind of pre-loosened it so we can actually just demonstrate how it comes apart. And my fingers are a little greasy, so it kind of makes it hard to get that off, but go ahead and take that off. Now we have our regulator spring, regulator pin, and our reg seat. Now this reg seat, if it ever gets dirty or you get a little burr or anything inside there, you can actually flip the reg seat and reuse the other side. So that kind of makes it nice and convenient just in case you don't have another reg seat laying around. From there, we're going to go ahead and remove our spool spacer and our spool. You'll just want to use a plastic dowel rod or a wooden dowel rod just to fit down in the front portion of the power tube and push your spool spacer and your spool right out from the front. So we have our spool spacer, our compression spring, and from there, we'll go ahead and get our spool out, and you have your spool. That's pretty much the basic parts identification. As far as maintenance goes, I usually just go through and lubricate each O-ring on the spool along with the spool spacer. And like I said, you want to use the lubricant that we provide in our accessory pack or just a Dow 33. It's the same exact stuff. So just go through and just kind of lubricate each point. Go ahead and reinsert that back into the valve body. And then just kind of give it a shake, and it should seat down in the bottom of the valve body there. Then from there you have your compression spring, and as you can see there's a little recessed area in the back of the spool, and we'll just kind of go ahead and shake that, and you can see how it kind of sits right there in the back of that recessed area of the spool. Then just go ahead and re-lubricate your spool spacer. You have a little nipple that's on the back end of the spool spacer. That end actually goes in first. So we'll go ahead and drop that in there. And that nipple will actually sit inside that spring. Now once you have it lubricated, that spacer will tend to come back out, which is fine because we're just going to finish reassembling it. You're going to take your regulator spring and pin, drop that right into the back of the spool spacer. Then you have your reg seat. Go ahead and make sure that you get your pin through the center hole on the reg seat. Just kind of wiggle it around. Make sure everything's seated correctly. Then you can go ahead and put your regulator housing back on. Like I said before, from the factory direct, we actually put the valve body into a vise with some soft jaws and tighten that valve body down, and then with our crescent wrench we tighten the regulator housing down. And you want to make sure that regulator housing is nice and snug. If not, that regulator housing will back out and it will cause some really inconsistent velocity and or low velocity. So now we got our regulator housing back on. We'll go ahead and reinsert our regulator piston. You just want to, go through, inspect the O-ring, lubricate it just using the grease. I usually just put a real thin coat and then just reinstall that. And you want to do this about every 8 to 10,000 rounds. That'll keep your gun running the most consistent, and that's pretty much just the basic maintenance on the regulator piston. So like I said, every 8 to 10,000 rounds. Then from there, just go ahead and put your spring and your regulator cap back on. And I usually just put that regulator cap on until the O-ring is no longer exposed. And that gives you a pretty good starting point. From there, you're going to go ahead and put your damper O-ring back onto the power tube. Just apply a little bit of lubricant. Go ahead and reinsert your bolt, and you can also apply a little bit of lubricant to the bolt. Like I said, a very thin coat is really all you need. And then from there, you're going to go ahead and put your bolt spring back on. And then you're going to lubricate the O-rings on your gauge plug. Your gauge plug is actually the last part of the assembly, but you're going to actually put your valve assembly back into the marker before you reinstall your gauge plug. And that is the basic disassembly, reassembly, parts identification, and maintenance of the flex valve.